Welcome to Epoch Report, where we look past the headlines at the structures underneath. Today, we examine whether Ukrainian drone swarms truly erode Russian military power or remain a tactical tool with inflated expectations. With stories of AI-guided attacks on Moscow airports and repeated refinery strikes, the narrative strains against the static Donbass front lines. A failed raid on Moscow saw most drones intercepted, while refinery hits forced production cuts, evidence, perhaps, of a meaningful drain. But electronic warfare, decoys, and cheap Russian counters blunt mass swarms, making cost curves flatten before strategic leverage appears. The real question: are these drones a transformative shift in warfare or an inconvenient cost that Russia can absorb? Now, let us get into it. Ukraine planned AI-guided drone swarms to hit Moscow airports, and Russian air defenses swatted most aside without a strategic blink. The Atlantic, August 2026. That's not asymmetry. That's a headline. One failed raid doesn't kill a strategy. Ukraine has hit oil refineries deep inside Russia and forced production cuts. Reuters. That's real economic pain, not a nuisance. Production cuts, yes, but Russia adapts. Pantsir and Tor systems claim high interception rates. Russian Ministry of Defense. Every wave teaches them the next counter. You trust Russian MOD claims? They've overstated kills all war. Independent footage shows drones getting through. Cost-wise, a $500 drone forcing a $2 million missile launch is exactly the asymmetry Ukraine needs. Fine, MOD numbers are suspect, but the strategic result isn't. Front lines in Donbass remain static despite Ukraine's drone production surge, Ukrainska Pravda. If swarms were decisive, we'd see breakthroughs. Static fronts could mean drones are preventing Russian advances, not failing. Deterrence isn't always territorial gain. Maybe the win is not losing ground. That's a fair reading, but it shifts the goalposts. The common belief is that swarms erode Russian power. Holding ground isn't erosion, it's attrition, and Russia has more bodies to spend. Attrition cuts both ways. Russian oil revenue is down from those refinery strikes. Reuters. Fewer rubles means less ability to sustain that body count. That's strategic, not tactical. But here's the hard part. Electronic warfare and decoys neutralize swarms at scale. A handful of precision strikes work. Mass swarms get jammed or lured into worthless fields.
Decoys and jamming are defensive answers, not a cure. Every Russian countermeasure costs money and attention. Ukraine's job is to raise the price, not win in one wave. But that's exactly the inflation of expectations. A price hike isn't a strategic shift. If the war ends with Russia holding territory, the drone strategy didn't deliver the eroding power the narrative promised. Then what would? You're measuring against a maximalist goal. Wars are rarely won by one weapon system. Drone swarms may not break Russia, but they may break the cost-benefit of continued invasion. That's a plausible argument, but it's not what the mainstream says. The mainstream says swarms will erode Russian military power. The evidence says Russia adapts faster than Ukraine can scale production. Scaling production has its own timeline. Ukraine surged output. Ukrainska Pravda. Russia's adaptation is reactive. There's a lag. And in war, lag is opportunity. You're ignoring that window. A window isn't a decisive shift. Decisive means changing the war's trajectory. The Moscow airport plan failed to do that. The Atlantic, August 2026. The Donbass lines hold. That's the outcome.
Or the outcome is Russia spending billions on air defenses that don't protect refineries. You call it a dead end. I call it a drain. The question is, which side runs out first?
That's the strongest counter. Economic drain is strategy. But the counter evidence cuts both ways. Russia adapts with decoys and jamming at scale, skeptic analysis. The cost curve may flatten before Ukraine gains strategic leverage.
Flattening is not reversing. Ukraine doesn't need to win every engagement, just enough to make occupation untenable. Drones lower the threshold for that. You're treating tactics as if they can't compound into strategy.
Compounding only works if the system survives contact. Mass swarms get neutralized by electronic warfare, skeptic analysis. The plan for Moscow airports proved that. Even with AI guidance, most never reached target.
One raid. You keep building a thesis on one raid. The refinery strikes worked repeatedly. Reuters. That's a pattern, not an anecdote. Strategy is judged by patterns, not single events. Point taken. The refinery pattern is real, but it hasn't moved the front. Russia still holds territory, still fights. Strategic erosion would show up somewhere. It doesn't, beyond economic discomfort. Economic discomfort is how wars end. You want a dramatic collapse. Ukraine just needs a costly stalemate. Drones make stalemate cheaper for Ukraine and more expensive for Russia. That's the shift. Cheaper for Ukraine? Sustaining drone ops requires parts, software, pilots, and constant replacement. That's a logistics burden. Russia's counters are passive, decoys and jamming, and cheap to deploy.
But Russia's counters consume attention and production capacity. Every decoy they build is a shell they didn't. That's the asymmetric trade-off. It doesn't need to be perfect, just persistent. Persistent, yes, but not decisive. And the stakes are concrete. If this is a dead end, Western billions in drone tech are misallocated. Stakes. We're betting on a weapon that hasn't won a battle, let alone a war.
Or the billions are misallocated if we don't. A cheaper defense against a larger invader is the only viable path. Calling it a dead end without a better alternative is just pessimism dressed as analysis.
A better alternative isn't required to prove a thesis wrong. The question is whether drone swarms erode Russian power. The evidence says they inconvenience it, and Russia adapts to inconvenience. Inconvenience that cuts oil revenue and forces production shifts is more than that. It's leverage. You dismiss it because it doesn't end the war this week. Strategy is patience, not spectacle. Patience is a virtue only if the trend bends. So far, the bend is toward adaptation, not breakthrough. The Moscow airport plan is the clearest test, and it failed to disrupt anything but headlines. The Atlantic, August 2026. Headlines matter, too. They signal to Russia that no city is safe. That psychological pressure is strategic. You can't measure it in frontline kilometers alone. Psychological pressure without physical consequence fades. Russia has absorbed worse blows. If drone swarms can't consistently penetrate, they become a known threat, and known threats get budgeted for.
And Ukraine gets better at building them cheaper. It's an arms race in miniature, and Ukraine has the innovation edge. Decisive might be too strong a word, but a tactical dead end? That's false.
Innovation edge against an industrial giant is a sprint against a marathoner. Russia can absorb losses. Ukraine can't. Swarms only work if they produce outsized results. So far, they produce viral videos.
Viral videos recruit drones, donations, and morale. That's not nothing. And in a war of attrition, morale is a munition. You're underselling the multiplier effect.
Munition, yes. Strategy, no. The common belief is that swarms erode Russian power. The evidence says they impose costs that Russia manages. That gap matters because we're spending real money on a promise of decisiveness.
Or we're spending money on the only viable resistance. Without drones, Ukraine's asymmetry shrinks to nothing. Even if it's not decisive, it's necessary. That's a different conclusion than dead end.
Necessary and decisive are different categories. I'll concede drones are necessary, but the argument that they will erode Russian military power is unproven. And the Moscow airport plan exposed the limits, not the promise.
Unproven doesn't mean false. It means the war is still being fought. The refinery strikes are evidence of erosion, even if you call it inconvenience. Your bar for decisive may just be too high for any weapon to meet.
Maybe that's the real lesson. No single weapon decides modern wars. The question is whether drone swarms deserve the strategic billing they're getting. I say they're a tool, not a turning point. Analysis of evidence. A tool that changes cost curves is a turning point, even if slow. The verdict isn't in, but dismissing it as a dead end, that's the error. The war's outcome will judge both of us. Then let's leave it there. Conventional explanations are incomplete, but so is the contrarian certainty. What's clear is that cheap swarms didn't break the war open, and that's a fact worth funding with more caution. Finally, on the core verdict, the dialogue concluded that drone swarms are necessary for Ukraine, but the claim of decisiveness remains unproven. The Moscow airport plan revealed the limits of mass penetration, while refinery strikes continue to demonstrate economic pressure. Cleanly, the evidence shows drones as a tool, not a turning point. Their true effect depends on whether compounded costs can outpace Russian adaptation. That is all for this episode. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it worth your time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Leave a comment below with where you think this goes. See you next time.